June 1944. The island of Saipan burns beneath a choking veil of smoke. The jungle trembles with the echo of distant shellfire. Among the shattered cliffs, a group of Japanese women crawl from the mouth of a dark cave, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. For weeks they had hidden underground with their children, convinced that capture meant torture, humiliation, or death. They had been told the Americans were devils, monsters who would desecrate their bodies and laugh over their corpses. Now, barefoot and trembling, they stare across a silent slope where US Marines stand watching, rifles lowered, medics kneeling with canteens of water and bandages ready. One woman falls to her knees, clutching her child. Another begins to sob uncontrollably, whispering apologies to the sky. But no gunfire comes, no cruelty, only quiet voices saying, "It's okay, you're safe now." For the women who had been taught that surrender was worse than death, this moment shattered an entire world of lies, the war that dehumanized everyone. Before those terrified women ever stepped into the sunlight on Saipan, the world they came from had already been shaped by decades of militarism, fear, and obedience. Japan in the early 20th century was not merely a nation at war. It was a nation built for war. From childhood, every citizen was taught a single truth, that the emperor was divine, and to die for him was the purest form of honor. Surrender was unthinkable. Defeat was not dishonor. It was erasure. In the 1930s, under Emperor Hirohito's reign and the iron guidance of the Imperial General Staff, the Japanese military expanded across Asia. In classrooms, schoolchildren memorized imperial rescripts promising eternal loyalty. Posters and radio broadcasts painted the Western enemy as savage, deceitful, and inhuman. Even women were woven into this ideology. They were told their duty was to see, as mothers birthing soldiers, as nurses tending the wounded, or as volunteers in the defense of the homeland. By 1941, when Japan struck Pearl Harbor, this militarized spirit had reached its peak. The nation's propaganda machine told its people that Japan was surrounded by barbaric Western powers intent on its destruction. Every American, every Briton, every foreign soldier was portrayed as a defiler of purity, a threat to the emperor's sacred nation. When the war turned against Japan, this ideology hardened further. On distant islands, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, entire Japanese garrisons chose suicide over surrender. Civilians, too, were drawn into this fatal logic. By 1944, Japan had begun conscripting women for labor, logistics, and even civil defense roles near the front lines. Many of these women were teachers, nurses, and clerks sent to territories soon consumed by fire. And when the US began its island-hopping campaign, the collision of two worlds became inevitable. For American troops, the Pacific War had become a grim and personal fight. The atrocities of Bataan, the mutilations of dead soldiers, and Japan's fanatical resistance had forged deep hatred. The code name "No Prisoners" was not official policy, but in the chaos of battle, mercy was rare. By mid-1944, the Pacific had become a theater of annihilation, each side convinced the other was less than human. Then came Saipan. A small volcanic island, heavily fortified and defended by 30,000 Japanese troops. For Tokyo, Saipan was sacred ground, the last barrier protecting the home islands. For the US, it was the key to reaching Japan's heart. When American forces landed in June 1944, they expected soldiers. Instead, they found civilians, families, children, and women who had been told that capture meant violation or slaughter. Japanese propaganda had prepared them for death. Leaflets, speeches, and radio addresses repeated the same lie. The Americans are demons. They will burn your children. They will destroy your honor. So when the American troops advanced, thousands of Japanese civilians, many of them women, fled into the mountains and caves. Mothers carried grenades. Some tied their children to their bodies before jumping from cliffs. Others hid in the darkness, clutching kitchen knives, praying the enemy would never find them. The war had stripped away empathy, leaving behind two armies facing each other as reflections of hate. But amid that darkness, on the beaches of Saipan, something profoundly human began to stir. Something no one on either side had expected. It began when the first women, starving and delirious, crawled out from hiding, and the Americans did not kill them. When propaganda collided with reality as the Battle of Saipan dragged into July 1944, the once prosperous island became a wasteland of shattered coral, smoke, and grief. Japanese command had ordered its defenders to fight to the death. For civilians, there was no distinction between battlefront and home. Every cave, every hut, every ravine had become part of the war. American soldiers advancing across the island soon realized they were not facing only soldiers. They began to hear the cries of children, the sobs of mothers, and the muffled whispers echoing from inside the cliffs. In those moments, the Pacific War, usually fought at a distance of bullets and explosions, became unbearably intimate. The Japanese civilians had been told there would be no mercy. In leaflets dropped before the invasion, Tokyo warned that capture meant rape and dismemberment. Women were advised to kill their infants before taking their own lives. Many obeyed. Entire families leapt from the cliffs of Marpi Point, later called Suicide Cliff. American troops watched in horror, POWs, wireless to stop the wave of self-destruction. But amid that horror, something began to shift. US medics, chaplains, and interpreters risked sniper fire to reach the caves. They carried white flags and megaphones, pleading in broken Japanese, "Come out, we will not harm you. You will live." At first, no one believed them, but eventually hunger and exhaustion overcame fear. A few women, trembling and skeletal, emerged from the shadows, clutching babies too weak to cry. They expected knives and laughter. Instead, they were met with bandages, canteens, and calm voices. American soldiers were stunned. They had been trained to see the Japanese as fanatics, barely human. Now they were feeding them chocolate, wrapping them in blankets, and hearing them whisper "arigato" through tears. The US command soon realized that many of these women were not soldiers, but auxiliary nurses and clerks conscripted from Japan's mainland or colonies. They had been brought to Saipan to serve the garrison, to type reports, tend the wounded, or cook meals. When the battle turned hopeless, they were ordered to die alongside the troops. Some disobeyed, quietly, desperately, and chose to live. American forces established temporary collection points for surrendering civilians. Under the burning sun, women lined up in silence, holding children, carrying small bundles of belongings, and staring at the strange men who offered them food instead of death. Military photographers captured these moments, women with hollow eyes, faces streaked with soot, children clinging to their skirts, and behind them, Marines guiding them gently toward aid stations. For many Americans, it was their first direct encounter with Japanese civilians. The experience shook them. War correspondents described the scenes with disbelief. Some compared it to the liberation of a prison. Others saw it as the moment when the Pacific War's hatred began to fracture. In Tokyo, however, the government suppressed all reports of captured civilians. Admitting that women and children had surrendered would shatter the illusion of national unity. Instead, radio broadcasts continued to praise the honorable deaths of Saipan's people, portraying suicide as virtue. The truth, that hundreds had survived through the mercy of the enemy, remained unspoken. Yet for those women who lived, that truth became unforgettable. They had seen the Americans' humanity firsthand. They had realized that the monsters they had feared were men capable of kindness, even amid the firestorm of war. As the US advanced toward Okinawa and the Japanese homeland, This quiet revelation began to echo through military reports and diaries. The soldiers called them the ones who didn't die. To the women, it was as if they had awakened in another world, one that defied everything their empire had promised. Because for the first time in their lives, these Japanese women, prisoners, survivors, enemies, were being treated as equals. The human shock. When the first captured Japanese women realized they were still alive, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. For days they had expected the sharp sting of a bayonet, the scream of a dying child, the humiliation of defeat. Instead, they were handed tin cups of water and food from ration tins marked US Army. Many refused to eat at first, believing it was poisoned. Others hesitated before accepting the smallest acts of kindness: a soldier wrapping a blanket around a shivering mother, a medic cleaning the wounds of a young girl burned by shrapnel. The disbelief was total. To them, compassion was not supposed to exist on the battlefield. Japan's wartime propaganda had left no room for humanity in the enemy. The women had been taught that Americans were beasts, unworthy of mercy and incapable of honor. They had seen posters showing grotesque caricatures of Western soldiers. They had heard, comme ça raconte, Manda's promise that the enemy would torture and defile them. Even surrendering, they were certain they were walking into hell. But when the hell never came, the emotional collapse was profound. Some began to sob uncontrollably, clinging to their children as if waiting for the illusion to shatter. Others stared in silence, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had believed all their lives. American war diaries tell of one such encounter near the northern coast of Saipan. A Marine corporal described finding 3 women hiding beside a dead tree. They were covered in soot and ash. One held an infant so weak it could barely move. The women fell to the ground, covering their heads, whispering, "Koros, Koros, kill us." He didn't raise his rifle. Instead, he lowered it, knelt, and offered a piece of bread. They didn't move for nearly a minute. Then, slowly, one of them reached out her hand. For the Marines who had fought through Tarawa and Guadalcanal, where surrender was rare and ambushes frequent, these moments were almost surreal. They had seen Japanese soldiers feign death to detonate grenades. They had learned to shoot without hesitation. Now they were holding babies, escorting women to safety, and facing the raw vulnerability of those they had once called the enemy. In the American camps set up along Saipan's beaches, the first shelters for female prisoners were established. Nurses from Navy hospital units treated wounds and malnutrition. Field kitchens prepared rice and vegetables when possible, understanding that the captured women could barely digest army rations. For many of these women, the simple act of receiving a warm meal from an American was more shocking than the battle itself. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was confusion, disbelief, and slowly recognition. A world that had been divided between us and them began to blur. One U.S. interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier from Hawaii, recalled how some women refused to speak even when addressed gently in their own language. They looked at him as though he were an apparition, a man who wore the enemy's uniform but spoke with their voice. Eventually, one nurse whispered, "Are you really Japanese?" He nodded. Her next words broke him. "Then why are you helping them?" He answered quietly, "Because helping them is helping you." This was the moral earthquake of the Pacific War. The moment when both sides began to see beyond the lies that had fueled years of bloodshed. For the Japanese women, it was an awakening that carried both gratitude and unbearable shame. They had survived by surrendering, something they had been told was unforgivable. Some refused to look at the American soldiers, keeping their heads bowed in silence, as if still awaiting judgment. Others tried to express thanks, a whispered "domo," a tearful nod, a small bow. Each gesture carried the weight of centuries of pride colliding with the raw truth of defeat. American officers noted that despite their exhaustion, many of the women maintained a quiet dignity. They washed their children before entering camp, folded their tattered clothes neatly, and avoided eye contact, as though holding on to the last remnants of identity in a world that had collapsed around them. To the Americans, they were no longer the faceless enemy. They were human, frightened, proud, and profoundly broken by the lies of war. For the Japanese women, that recognition was both a comfort and a wound, because it meant they had been wrong, not only about the Americans, but about everything they had believed their nation stood for. The American perspective, for the men of the U.S. Marine Corps and Army who fought through Saipan and later Okinawa, compassion had not been part of their training. They had seen comrades mutilated, prisoners feigning surrender only to detonate grenades, and civilians throwing themselves off cliffs in blind terror. The Pacific had hardened them. It had taught them that hesitation could mean death. And yet, when the smoke cleared, many of these same men found themselves carrying Japanese children, guiding terrified women to safety, and realizing that war had forced them to become caretakers of the very people they had been sent to destroy. In reports filed by Marine field commanders, the tone shifted dramatically after the Battle of Saipan. What began as tactical notes soon included words like refugees, medical assistance, and protection. The presence of so many women and children was unexpected, and it forced the U.S. military to adapt, not only in logistics, but in morality. General Holland Smith, commanding the V Amphibious Corps, ordered that all civilians, regardless of nationality, be treated humanely and provided with medical care. This was not merely policy, it was a moral necessity. The photographs taken by war correspondents show Marines holding infants, Navy corpsmen bandaging women's wounds, and soldiers building makeshift shelters from the wreckage of battle. These scenes of humanity did not erase the violence of war, but they revealed something deeper, that even amid destruction, decency could endure. For many American troops, this was their first intimate encounter with Japanese civilians. The contrast between propaganda and reality was staggering. They had been told that every Japanese would fight to the last breath, that civilians were complicit in the war machine. Yet here they were, malnourished women clutching children, their hands trembling, their eyes pleading not for mercy but for understanding. An Army medic, Private First Class Daniel Myers, wrote in his diary, "They came out of the cave expecting us to kill them. One woman had tied her baby to her chest. She wouldn't let go of the grenade she'd been given. When she saw us put down our rifles, she dropped it and just cried. I'll never forget that sound." Moments like these changed men. They didn't erase hatred overnight, but they carved cracks into it, cracks wide enough for empathy to seep through. In field hospitals, U.S. nurses tended to wounded Japanese women under the same canvas roofs as injured Marines. Medical orderlies reported the astonishment of their patients when treated with respect. One nurse recalled a Japanese girl bowing repeatedly after being handed a cup of clean water, the simplest of human gestures suddenly elevated to something sacred. The U.S. Army's civil affairs units soon established temporary civilian internment camps on Saipan and Tinian, designed not as prisons but as protective zones. Women and children were provided shelter, food, and basic education, while their identities were processed. The military also enlisted Japanese-American interpreters from the Military Intelligence Service, MIS, young Nisei soldiers whose families had been interned back home in the United States. For these interpreters, the experience was personal. They stood between two worlds, American uniforms on their backs, the Japanese language in their mouths, and the pain of divided identity in their hearts. Some were met with confusion or suspicion by the civilians, others with relief. They were proof that mercy could cross even the sharpest cultural divide. Behind the American compassion, however, lay complexity. This was still a war of annihilation. While medics saved lives on Saipan, B-29 bombers were being prepared in the Marianas to firebomb Tokyo. The same humanity shown to women and children on one island would coexist with total destruction unleashed upon their homeland months later. That contradiction became one of the Pacific War's enduring paradoxes: the ability of human beings to display both mercy and devastation within the same breath. Yet for the individuals on Saipan, the moral clarity of that moment mattered. Many soldiers wrote home about what they had seen, not about victories, but about the faces of the civilians they had helped. A few even enclosed photographs: a Marine handing a rice ball to a Japanese child, a nurse kneeling beside a woman who could barely stand. These images, quietly passed among families back in the United States, carried a message that official reports could not. It said, the enemy was human after all. And in that recognition, something profound began to change in the American mind. The Pacific War would continue, through Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima, but the soldiers who had once seen only targets now carried with them the memory of those women who surrendered and survived. It was a reminder that the greatest victory in war is not always won by force. Sometimes it is found in the refusal to become what the enemy believes you to be. The Caves of Saipan. By early July 1944, the Battle of Saipan had reached its final catastrophic crescendo. The Japanese defense was collapsing. The Imperial Army's commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, had already committed suicide. Yet scattered across the island's northern cliffs, thousands of civilians, mostly women and children, still hid inside the blackened caverns that honeycombed the limestone ridges above Marpi Point. It was there, in those dark caves, that war's cruelty and compassion met face to face. American units advancing toward the sea heard faint cries echoing through the rocks. They called out in Japanese, using captured loudspeakers, "You will not be harmed! Come out!" But inside, no one moved. The women huddled together, clutching grenades handed to them by retreating soldiers. Some prayed, some whispered farewells, others held their children close, waiting for the inevitable. For weeks they had survived on rainwater and bits of rice, terrified of capture. Outside, the US Marines waited in uneasy silence, unsure if the next sound would be a surrender or an explosion. Then, without warning, a blast tore through the air. One cave had erupted, an entire family choosing death. The shock rippled through both sides. Marines ducked for cover. Medics clenched their jaws. Moments later, another explosion echoed from the cliffs, then another. As the sun dipped toward the Pacific horizon, dozens of figures appeared atop the ridges, men, women, and children silhouetted against the smoke-filled sky. Some waved white cloths, others ran, and some, tragically, leapt. The cliffs that day became both a grave and a monument to the madness of propaganda. Among the chaos, one group of Marines spotted movement inside a cave near the base of the cliff. Through binoculars they saw several women, their faces streaked with soot, clutching infants. A corpsman shouted through a loudhailer, "Don't die, we will help you!" Silence. Then, faintly, a child's cry. Moments later, a small figure stepped forward. A woman, barefoot, trembling, covered in ash, carried a baby in her arms. Behind her, others followed. Slowly, cautiously, they emerged into the fading light. The Marines lowered their rifles. One man dropped to his knees and held out his canteen. The woman took it with shaking hands, lifted it to her lips, then froze. She had expected poison, but when she tasted only water, she began to weep. This moment, witnessed by dozens of soldiers and later recorded in combat reports, marked one of the first mass surrenders of Japanese civilians in the Pacific. Photographs captured it: women emerging from shadows, children clutching rations, Marines standing quietly beside them, their faces unreadable. It was not victory. It was revelation. In the aftermath, American units combed through more caves, calling out for survivors. Each discovery carried the same haunting mixture of relief and horror, the living rescued, the dead still warm from their final acts of despair. Medics established triage points on the beaches. Nurses washed wounds with seawater. Interpreters translated words of reassurance through tears. The rescued women spoke little. Most simply stared at the men who had spared them, unable to comprehend what mercy meant. For the Americans, the experience left an indelible mark. They had seen courage before, on the beaches of Tarawa, in the jungles of Guadalcanal, but this was something different. This was the courage of survival, the defiance of a lie that demanded death. When word of the rescue spread through the ranks, even hardened officers paused. Colonel M.D. Hall, in a field report, wrote, "The enemy's women are taught to fear us as beasts, yet today they were treated as equals. They came out of their caves expecting execution and found compassion instead. It may be the only battle we have truly won." The statement was brief, but it captured the essence of what had unfolded on Saipan. For the first time in the Pacific War, mercy had challenged fanaticism, and won. As night fell over the island, the rescued women slept under tarps beside their American captors. The sounds of war faded, replaced by the gentle rhythm of waves against the shore. Somewhere in the darkness, a child cried, and a Marine, exhausted and mud-stained, handed over his blanket without a word. That night, under the quiet stars of Saipan, the enemy ceased to exist, if only for a few fleeting hours. Okinawa, humanity amid chaos. By the spring of 1945, the war had reached its bloodiest chapter. Okinawa, a lush island of coral hills and sugarcane fields, became the final proving ground before an invasion of Japan itself. What unfolded there would scar both nations forever. To the American commanders, Okinawa was a military objective, a stepping stone to Tokyo. To the Japanese soldiers and civilians, it was home, the last defense of the emperor's land. Between them stood an ocean of fear, loyalty and propaganda that had turned ordinary plea into instruments of war. From the first days of the invasion, civilians fled into caves, the same kind that had swallowed the people of Saipan months earlier. Entire families crowded into limestone tunnels beneath the Shuri line, listening to the thunder of artillery echo through the rock. Mothers muffled their children's cries, praying the Marines wouldn't hear them. Outside, American flamethrowers and demolition charges turned the ground into a living furnace. But amid the devastation, moments of humanity still flickered, fragile, fleeting, yet unforgettable. The encounter in the cave. In one such cavern near Mabuni Ridge, a U.S. Army medic named Private Harold James crawled through the smoke, searching for wounded. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood. His flashlight beam caught movement. A woman crouched in the corner, clutching a small boy. Her face was streaked with dust. Her eyes, wide and terrified, followed every motion of his hand. James raised his palms slowly. "It's okay," he whispered. "No hurt." The woman didn't respond. She tightened her grip on the child. Behind her lay two bodies, a man and another child, motionless. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a bandage roll, then a chocolate bar, placing them on the ground between them. The boy stared at the shiny wrapper. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, cautiously, the child crawled forward and picked it up. When he bit into it, his eyes widened, the first sweet taste of something not made by war. That single act broke the silence. The woman began to sob. She pressed her forehead to the floor, whispering over and over in Japanese, words James didn't understand: gratitude, apology, disbelief. He radioed for an interpreter. When one finally arrived, they brought the woman and her son out of the cave. Later, she told the Americans that soldiers had warned her. The Americans will kill your children. They will torture you. Better to die first. But the man who had found her had done none of those things. He had saved her child and given him chocolate. The cost of compassion. Stories like that one spread quietly through the ranks. Some soldiers, hardened by years of bloodshed, dismissed them as weakness. Others saw them as the only proof that their humanity had survived the war. Yet compassion came with a price. In Okinawa, hesitation could mean death. Civilians often hid alongside Japanese soldiers, and many refused to surrender even when surrounded. Marines who approached waving hands sometimes met hidden grenades. Trust became both salvation and peril. Still, some chose mercy anyway. At the cliffs of Mabuni, as the Japanese lines finally broke, US troops used loudspeakers to call out in Japanese, "Come out, you will not be harmed," just as they had done on Saipan. Some obeyed. Others did not. Families leapt from the cliffs together, their cries carried away by the wind. Even after months of combat, many Okinawan civilians still believed that capture meant unspeakable suffering. Among the dead, medics found letters, written by mothers to their unborn children, by sons to their ancestors, by teachers to their students. They spoke of duty, purity, and fear. Every word was soaked in the tragedy of a nation convinced that surrender was worse than death. A soldier's reflection: when the battle finally ended, Okinawa was no longer an island of beauty. It was a graveyard. More than 100,000 Japanese civilians were dead. Tens of thousands of soldiers lay unburied among them. Even American veterans who had survived Normandy, Iwo Jima, and Guadalcanal described Okinawa as hell itself. Weeks later, Private Harold James wrote in his journal, "I've seen what bombs can do to flesh, but today I saw what lies can do to souls. One woman looked at me and couldn't believe I was human. I wonder what she saw when she finally did." His words never made it into history books, but they capture something deeper than any statistic: the cost of dehumanization and the quiet defiance of those who chose to show mercy in a world consumed by hate. As the rains of June 1945 fell over Okinawa, the island lay silent at last. In the distance, the Pacific shimmered, calm, endless, indifferent. For a brief moment, the war paused, and the survivors, American and Japanese alike, stood at the edge of an abyss that had taken everything from them. And though they could not yet see it, the echoes of their suffering would soon lead to a decision that would change the world forever. A decision forged in fear, justified in strategy, and remembered in fire. The fire that ended everything. Hiroshima-Nagasaki. August 6, 1945. Dawn over Hiroshima. The city still slept beneath the rising summer sun. Fishermen on the Ota River cast their nets into the calm water. Children walked to school wearing bright white uniforms. Factory whistles echoed faintly through the narrow streets. At precisely 8:15 a.m., a single silver aircraft, the Enola Gay, appeared in the blue sky. It carried one bomb, codenamed Little Boy. A blinding flash erupted, brighter than anything the world had ever seen. In an instant, the heart of Hiroshima vanished. Buildings, bridges, and lives consumed by a wave of white fire. Within seconds, 250,000 souls were engulfed. The sound came next, a rolling thunder that flattened the city and left only a charred silence behind. Those who survived the initial blast stumbled through the ruins, their skin burned, clothes shredded into rags. A woman's hair had turned completely white. A man walked holding a child who would never open his eyes again. From the hills surrounding the city, smoke rose into a towering column, a shape that would forever define the end of one world and the beginning of another. The decision, the order to use too. The atomic bomb had been signed by President Harry S. Truman only days before. To the American leadership, it was a grim necessity, a weapon meant to end the war swiftly, to prevent the invasion of Japan that could cost over 1 million Allied lives. But inside Japan, surrender was still unthinkable. The Supreme War Council remained divided. Army leaders swore to fight until every citizen had fallen. Civilians were training with bamboo spears, preparing to repel an enemy that could never be stopped. American codebreakers had intercepted secret Japanese cables. Even after Okinawa, even after the Soviet Union declared war, Tokyo was not ready to yield. So the decision was made, not out of malice, but desperation, to end a war that refused to end itself. Nagasaki. 3 days later, August 9, 1945. Another morning, another city. Nagasaki, a port surrounded by green mountains, known for its shipyards and its quiet Catholic churches. At 11:02 a.m., the B-29 boxcar released the second bomb, Fat Man. This time, the target was obscured by clouds. The bomb missed the intended center by nearly 2 miles. Even so, the explosion leveled much of the Urakami Valley. Tens of thousands were killed instantly. Hospitals collapsed, the cathedral crumbled into dust, and entire families vanished beneath the shockwave. Yet once again, among the ruins, small moments of humanity endured. Survivors remember American planes circling overhead days later, not to bomb, but to drop leaflets calling for peace. In the hospitals, doctors who had lost their own families continued to treat the wounded. A nun who survived the blast prayed beside the remains of her convent, her voice shaking. May they all find mercy, even those who brought this upon us. Shock and surrender. When the reports reached Tokyo, disbelief turned to silence. Emperor Hirohito was informed of the destruction. For the first time, he intervened directly in government deliberations. He told his ministers, "The time has come to bear the unbearable." On August 15, 1945, Japan accepted the terms of surrender. For the first time, the emperor's voice was heard by his people. Crackling through the radio, he spoke not of defeat but of survival, urging his subjects to endure the unendurable to build a new peace. In the streets of Tokyo, people knelt and wept. Some wept for the end of suffering, others for the loss of everything they believed in. Across the Pacific, sailors aboard American ships listened in stunned silence. The war that had begun in 1939, that had consumed nations and continents, was finally over. But for those who had lived through it, peace felt almost unreal. The world had changed too suddenly, too completely. The meaning of the fire. When Allied occupation forces entered Hiroshima weeks later, even hardened soldiers stood speechless. There was no city left, only ash, twisted steel, and the faint outlines of people burned into stone walls. Survivors, known later as hibakusha, wandered through the ruins carrying photos of loved ones who no longer existed. Among the first Americans to arrive were medical teams, not to fight but to help. They treated burns, distributed food, and studied the unknown effects of radiation. Many Japanese survivors, expecting brutality, instead found compassion. Some cried when offered water. Others bowed, confused, to the very soldiers they had once been taught to hate. It was an echo of Saipan, Okinawa, and every battlefield before. The same disbelief, the same realization that their enemies were not monsters. The fire. The transformation begins. The occupation authority, known as SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, moved swiftly to reform the very core of Japanese life. Censorship on criticism of the government was lifted. Women who had been legally bound to obedience under Meiji law were granted the right to vote. Political prisoners were released, and in early 1946 Japan began drafting a new constitution, one that would redefine its identity forever. Article 9 became its soul. The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. The words were revolutionary. For a country that had once sent its youth to die in suicidal waves, it was a declaration of rebirth. But the change went deeper than politics. American educators introduced new curricula focused on critical thinking instead of obedience. Farm reforms redistributed land from feudal landlords to the peasants who worked it. Factories reopened under civilian management. Newspapers that had once printed propaganda now published stories of hope, recovery, and even remorse. Still, the wounds of war were everywhere. Every family had lost someone. Every city carried scars that time alone could not erase. The unspoken bond. In Hiroshima, American doctors worked side by side with Japanese nurses to treat radiation victims. In Nagasaki, orphanages built by U.S. relief organizations began housing the children of the dead, both civilian and soldier. The American Red Cross provided food and blankets through the cold winter of 1945 to 46. And in Tokyo, Japanese interpreters joined Allied command posts to bridge the gap between two worlds that had once sworn to destroy each other. For the Japanese civilians, especially the women who had once feared capture, this new era felt surreal. The same uniform that had haunted their nightmares now represented protection. American soldiers helped rebuild homes, offered medical care, and handed out chocolate bars to children who had never tasted such a thing before. Many could not reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught. An older woman in Yokohama later told a journalist, "We expected demons, they brought us bread." These gestures, small yet deeply human, became the foundation of a silent reconciliation. Redefining the Emperor. Perhaps the most symbolic moment of transformation came on September 27, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito visited General MacArthur at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. A single photograph captured the encounter. MacArthur stood tall, casual, hands on hips. Beside him, the Emperor, dressed in formal morning attire, appeared smaller, dignified, yet subdued. That image spread around the world. For the Japanese people, it shattered an ancient illusion. Their emperor, once seen as divine, now stood as a mortal man beside his former enemy. MacArthur later wrote, "This picture did more to democratize Japan than any law we could ever pass. It was not humiliation. It was transformation. And it marked the beginning of a Japan that would soon rise, not through conquest, but through cooperation and innovation." By 1947, the new constitution was in effect. A nation once built on militarism had rewritten its identity in just 2 years. But beneath the progress, quiet questions lingered, about guilt, memory, and the price of survival. And in those questions lay the seeds of Japan's greatest internal reckoning. Memory, guilt, and the women who remembered. As Japan began to rebuild, the physical scars of war slowly faded beneath concrete and glass. But in the hearts of its people, especially its women, the wounds remained. They had lived through bombings, starvation, and fear. They had lost husband, sons, and homes. And many had carried one more burden, shame for having survived when others did not. The silence, after the surrender. In the years following 1945, silence blanketed Japan. Survivors rarely spoke of what they had seen. The word surrender itself carried a sense of dishonor that few could bear to discuss. For many Japanese women who had been told that capture meant disgrace, survival felt like betrayal. On Saipan, Okinawa, and the Philippine Islands, hundreds of women who had once hidden from the Americans now lived in occupied towns, raising their children in peace for the first time, but haunted by what they had believed. They remembered the caves. They remembered the loudspeakers calling for surrender. And they remembered the soldiers who, instead of cruelty, had offered water, food, and mercy. To some, it was impossible to comprehend. To others, it became the beginning of healing. One survivor from Saipan, interviewed in 1952, recalled, "We were told the Americans would kill us, but when they came, they gave my baby milk. I cried for hours because I realized everything we had been taught was a lie." That realization, that their greatest fear had been built on falsehood, reshaped how many Japanese civilians came to see the war. The propaganda had collapsed, leaving space for humanity to re-enter. The women's role in rebuilding memory. In post-war Japan, women became central to reconstruction, not only physically but spiritually. Many took jobs for the first time, working as teachers, nurses, and clerks. They raised a new generation free from the militarist indoctrination that had defined their own youth. Writers and artists, many of them women, began capturing what had once been unspeakable. Poet Sadako Kurihara, a Hiroshima survivor, wrote about the night of the bombing when a woman gave birth inside the ruins. Amid the flames of hell, a child was born. The baby's first cry mingled with the moans of the dying. Such voices gave the unimaginable a language. They transformed tragedy into testimony. Others, like the women of Okinawa, joined peace movements, building memorials not to victory, but to remembrance. They collected names of the lost, both Japanese and American, carved into the black stone walls of the Cornerstone of Peace Memorial decades later. Their message was simple: all lives lost are equal. These acts of remembrance carried quiet defiance. They resisted the old idea that dying for the emperor was the only form of honor. Now, survival itself became an act of courage, and telling the truth became an act of patriotism. The burden of guilt, yet guilt remained, not only among civilians, but among soldiers, teachers, and mothers who had once believed in the cause. Many who had encouraged children to volunteer as kamikaze pilots lived the rest of their lives in silent regret. Some wrote letters to the families of the dead, asking forgiveness. Others turned to religion, trying to reconcile faith with memory. Even decades later, former soldiers who had encountered captured civilians on the battlefield admitted that they too had been deceived, told that Americans would slaughter them without mercy. One veteran of Okinawa said in a 1970 interview, "We were trained to see the enemy as beasts, but when I saw them feed our wounded, I understood who had truly lost their humanity." Such reflections became more common as Japan's post-war generation grew up. Children born after 1945 began to ask questions about what their parents had done, what they had believed, and why. The silence began to crack. Reconciliation through memory. By the 1960s and 70s, American and Japanese veterans groups began meeting. Former enemies shook hands. Survivors of Saipan and Okinawa returned to the sites of their trauma, placing flowers where once there had been blood. Some Japanese women met the American soldiers who had captured them, now old men, and thanked them for their kindness. These meetings were not about forgiveness alone. They were about acknowledgement, a shared understanding of what war had taken from both sides. Documentaries, memoirs, and public museums began to tell the full story: the soldiers, the civilians, and the women who had once believed surrender meant death. And through these retellings, one truth became clear. The most powerful victory of the post-war era was not military, it was moral. The women who once trembled in fear of the Americans now taught their children English. Their grandchildren grew up watching American films, listening to jazz, studying abroad. The cultures that had once sought to annihilate each other were now bound by trade, friendship, and mutual respect. In the end, the memories of Saipan, Okinawa, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki were not erased. They became part of Japan's identity. A reminder of how far fear can go, and how compassion can bring a nation back from its own darkness. And from that silence, from those women who remembered, the modern Japan was born. What humanity learned from their surrender. History often remembers wars by the battles that ended them. But true endings, the ones that change humanity, are found in the quiet moments that follow. In Saipan's caves, in the burned fields of Okinawa, in the ruins of Hiroshima. There, among the ashes, humanity rediscovered itself. The surrender of Japan was more than the close of a global conflict. It was the collapse of an idea, that nations must destroy others to prove their own worth. For the Japanese civilians who once believed that Americans were monsters, survival revealed something far more powerful than conquest: mercy. The women who had been told that capture meant shame discovered that kindness could exist even in the uniforms of their enemies. The soldiers who had been trained to kill saw that compassion could save more lives than victory ever could. And in that fragile understanding, the world glimpsed a truth it had nearly burned away. That empathy is the last defense against the madness of war. When General MacArthur met Emperor Hirohito, when medics bandaged the hands of those they once fought, when Japanese mothers accepted food from the very men they had feared, those moments became the true markers of peace. Not treaties, not flags, but humanity restored. For every woman who stepped out of a cave and was treated as an equal, history shifted slightly toward hope. Their surrender was not weakness. It was the beginning of something stronger than empire: reconciliation. The war taught the world the limits of destruction, but the survivors taught it the power of compassion. And though decades have passed, the lesson remains clear. In the face of hatred and fear, the greatest victory any civilization can claim is to choose humanity, even when it has every reason not to.